Hey folks, just a heads up for upcoming live events as part of the Spooky Spectacular. We'll be doing a live stream and live recording event at Arcane in Durham, North Carolina on September 29th. Charlie will be at the Abbeville Upstate Spirit Conference in Abbeville, South Carolina. I'll be at Splatterflix in Durham at the Carolina Theater. And beyond spooky season, we'll both be at Retcon in Cary in February of 2023. There are links to all of those and more information in the show notes to this episode. Thanks a lot.
You are listening to Arcane Carolinas, an exploration of the Carolinas' folklore, legends, myths, and modern weird. Each episode, we examine the historical context of our topic and aim to preserve some of the stories that help make this part of the world such a fascinating place.
Do you want to bring us in?
Yeah, I guess that's it, huh? That's the intro.
Like the ghost of an intro.
Yeah. Hi. Let's tell them who it is. Hi, I'm your co-host, Charlie Mushaw.
I'm your other co-host, multi-award-winning novelist, Michael G. Williams.
This week's episode is brought to you by British Knight Sneakers.
I feel like we're like one possible minute away from a great big morning show soundboard.
Yeah, but that was the sneakers on Double Dare, right? The British Knight, it's like always the prize.
Beats me. I knew that show existed, but I was like just too old for it.
Gotcha. The prizes always leapt in like exponential values. Would be like, you won a boombox, and it'd be like, yay, this makes sense. It's a kid show. Woo! Mm-hmm. Oh, British Knight sneakers. You're like, oh, I've never seen those at the store, but cool. A Nash skateboard. And you're like, cool. A Chrysler minivan. Well, that escalated quickly. It went from like stuff that kids and family would be like, oh, neat, all the way to like, and you got a car.
Wow.
Like, whoa, what? Huh?
That's pretty wild.
If I recall correctly, and it's been years and years and years, decades at least, but I think the prizes were tied to the flags, right? Like as you went through the obstacle course at the end of the show, at the end of each obstacle, there'd be a flag. And like the amount of prizes you got lined up with what flags you got.
Oh, okay.
There you go. I didn't know how to bring us in. So I used my Double Dare prize guy voice and taking us down another path that has nothing to do with the show. This is becoming a recurring theme.
That's okay. That's okay. That's interesting to me. Somewhere out there in the world, there's probably a documentary that's an oral history of Double Dare, and that would be really interesting.
In today's episode, not to steal your thunder, but it's a little ghosty, right?
Oh, it's very ghosty.
Okay. And ectoplasm could be considered slime.
Yes.
And slime was a big part of Double Dare.
Okay. Well, there we go. Look at you. You're drawing those connections. I love it.
Just like the connections to arcanecarolinas.com, where you can go and find all of our social media, our web store, and previous episodes.
Gosh, all kinds of stuff.
If you've liked this ridiculous tangent and poor segues, please leave us a rating on Apple Podcast. It costs you nothing to touch a picture of a couple of stars.
Preferably 5 of those stars.
Yeah. And leave a note if you're feeling froggy.
Speaking of ectoplasm and ghosts, today we're going to discuss the other gray man of Pawley's Island.
Is that like the RC Cola?
I mean, arguably. Yeah, arguably. Okay. So when we did the Gray Man episode last year in 2021, I mentioned that there were other stories similar to it and that I kind of wanted it to be the first in like a little mini series of gray people of South Carolina. So now we're going to do the second of those 3, an alternate version, not of the same story at all, but of a totally unrelated experience. Just to recap the Gray Man of Pawley's Island real quick. The most elaborate theory of his origin, and the one we found sort of repeated everywhere, was that he was this guy who was coming back to Pawley's Island to marry his fiancée. He's traveling with an enslaved man. He dies in the course of that trip. And the enslaved man goes to tell the guy's fiancée that he died. The fiancée is totally distraught. She ends up wandering the beaches, mourning her fiancé, and then eventually sees an apparition of him after a few days.
Stop dead. Stop walking around.
You'll catch a cold. You probably won't on Pawley's Island, but And then he warns her of an approaching storm. She and her family leave, and they're okay. Everybody else is not okay.
Run, girl, get some help.
And then since that time, every time he appears, he's considered a harbinger of a storm. And if you interact with him and you heed his warning, you're okay. But other people who do not heed his warning presumably are not.
What a fun ghost to be. Just hey, ding dong, get to scooting.
Right. No, I'm not just here to rattle chains. I'm here to tell y'all some stuff. I really do like that he has utility. He's got to stay busy in the afterlife. One of my favorite things about that story was how many people who were reported to have encountered him were verifiably real people.
Yeah, totally.
We couldn't verify that origin story, in part because it doesn't really include any details that could be verified. But one of the origin stories was that the gray man was the ghost of this guy named Plowden C.J. Weston, who at the time owned Hagley, which was a rice plantation nearby, and who died in 1864. And if you'll recall from that episode, he left everything to his wife. She sold the estate to a friend and business partner of his in return for a lifelong income. And one of the theories was that it was Weston looking for his home or looking for his wife or whatever. We didn't really buy that story. It didn't really.
Where's all my rice?
But this is the other gray man of Pawley's Island. South Carolina Folk Tales is a book that we've talked about before. It's actually what we used to originally draw from for the Ghost Town of Goshen Hill. That was one of the research books that I used for that episode last year. It was published by the University of South Carolina in partnership with the WPA, a New Deal program, and it was published in 1941. It includes legends and lore and folk tales from all places in South Carolina collected between 1935 and 1941. It collected stories from a lot of different people as well as places, but it specifically saw as part of that effort to preserve the lore of people of color in South Carolina at a time when there was very little, if anything, being done to sort of document and preserve their unique contributions to the culture and the history of that area. So the first time I read it, there were stories and passages which, sort of to my modern eyes, the first time I read them seemed like they were racist caricatures of Black people using stereotypes of African-American vernacular English. But the introduction and the foreword for the book note that the writers and editors consciously chose in the writing of it to try to preserve the dialect of the people they spoke with as a way to literally preserve the sound of the speech and the experience of hearing those people tell these stories. Literally in print form, they wanted to preserve their voices.
Yeah, taking it a step further, this is something that we've talked about not while recording. Gullah culture in South Carolina. Gullah is considered its own language.
Yeah.
And it's considered a spoken language, not a written language. But if you write it out, it's its own thing, man. To a point that you made to me one of the times we were talking about this, it actually, in some cases, goes well beyond a dialect.
In fact, in that introduction to the book, they talk about the fact that they interviewed Gullah people, and the Gullah is a language that is distinct from English, even if it is derived from English, arguably. It's also derived from a lot of other languages. Some people describe it as a patois language, but it is its own independent mode of speech, and they were attempting to phonetically write the way that the Gullah people they spoke with spoke to them so that they could preserve that.
And there's still thousands of people that speak Gullah. If you Google it, you'll find all kinds of interesting information. And, if you're listening to this show, you probably like hearing a bit about history. So check it out. Gullah.
Yeah, the Gullah people live along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. They extend even into northern Florida and some parts of southeastern North Carolina, where we call down east. And a really significant portion of this book is devoted to preserving their stories and their storytelling at a time when it was considered possible that that culture was going to vanish. I mention all this because I try very hard to be very forward looking in my own views and to treat all people with respect. And I'm not the sort of person to accept, well, that's just how they were at that time as an excuse for something. Like that doesn't really excuse prejudice. When you look at any point in time, there were in fact people who did not share that prejudice, whatever prejudice it is. They didn't try to promulgate that prejudice. And so if I were writing this book today, I might not make the same choice they did because I would maybe not feel comfortable writing it out that way. But when you read why they wrote the book that way, then I think they were trying really hard to show respect for the people that they interviewed and for the stories that they were preserving by just not altering the voice in which those stories were told at the time. And I mention all of that because I requested that the North Carolina Government and Heritage Library, which has a copy of the physical book from 1941, digitize that book and make it publicly available. And they've done so. And in fact, there is a link to that in the show notes.
Which is really cool that they did that.
Yeah, it's really neat. You just, anything that they have, you can put a digitization request. And then if they are able to, they have a grant-funded program with the Internet Archive. Well, they will get that book scanned and they'll get it transcribed also so that you can search the text as well as like read images of the physical pages. It is really cool. But I mentioned that because I feel like it's really important to discuss that ahead of sending people to look at that book if they're interested, because I want people to be able to make an informed choice about whether to consume a resource that they might consider something harmful. And I don't think that that concern is unique to this book. I think that we both probably constantly, whenever we're looking at like the real traumas in real history and how marginalized people have been treated in the wider culture at the time of their experience, and especially in subsequent accounts created by people other than themselves, we have to try to kind of figure out how do we engage with that history without validating mistreatment and without overlooking mistreatment and also without abandoning that history. Because the first time I read the book, not having read the foreword, I just like dove into a story. My reaction was, whoa. Anyway, on page 66 of South Carolina Folk Tales, there is a story, the beginning of a story, and it's one of the longer ones in the book, actually, which I found really interesting. And it is prefaced with a description that says it is a firsthand account of an experience with ghosts furnished by Eugene F. LaBruce of near Georgetown, South Carolina being the biggest town near Pawleys Island and the plantation that was near there called Hagley and things like that. This story starts out with Mr. LaBruce describing that at the time of the experience, which was in 1918, he was, quote, engaged in carrying passengers between Pawleys Island and the ferry landing at Hagley on the Waccamaw Neck, using a large automobile and making the trip several times a day. He then goes on to explain that there are these set times when a ferry would come over to this wharf near the former plantation, and he would wait there with his car at those times, pick up anybody who had made the trip, and then drive them to their destination on Pawleys Island. And from the sound of things, he was sort of one part taxi cab and one part party bus. Because like one of his regular times was 11 p.m. And he describes that when people came over late at night, it was so he could drive them to the beach to go surf bathing, which is his term, which I think is just a lovely little turn of phrase. And he'll sometimes describe that the people who were coming over then were like returning from work. Mm-hmm. But sometimes he describes them as jolly parties, which kind of made it sound to me like maybe these were young people going to party on the beach, which I think is really kind of delightful.
Good for them.
Yeah. He goes on to say, quote, reaching the ferry landing one night about 11:15, I thought I would stretch out on a piece of old canvas on the wharf and get a little rest before the boat arrived from the city. The moon was shining brightly, flooding the landscape with a soft glow, and every object was plainly visible. The scene was a peaceful one, and a few minutes after I had made myself comfortable, I fell asleep. The dream that came to me that night was so vivid that I can remember every detail to this day. So he says explicitly that what he's about to describe was a dream, and he knows that.
Okay.
He says that in this dream, he was standing on the wharf during the daytime as part of a crowd of people dressed in what he describes as Civil War era clothing, and that he had the feeling that the Civil War had maybe just ended. And, you know, kind of like in a dream, you get that sense of like there is information that is not obviously apparent to you, but you know it.
Get filled in.
Yeah, exactly. So the crowd that he's in is gathered in front of a small church there on the wharf. And this white couple emerges from the church to greet the crowd, having just been married.
Hello!
The bride he describes as a striking brunette, and the groom he describes as a handsome blonde. So as they come out there and they're greeting the crowd and everybody's really excited and happy for them, another guy dressed in a Confederate uniform, so I guess it hasn't rained lately to melt it off of him, but he rides up on an exhausted horse.
Yeah.
He, quote, dashed up to the clearing astride a horse that had evidently been running at top speed for hours.
Ew.
The bride sees the guy on horseback and cries out, "It is too late. I have just married the other man."
Oh.
The late arrival says he understands and that he will, quote, fade out of the picture and leave them be.
Like that gif where the guy's like just fades.
Yeah. The groom says, no, you can't do that. Quote, if anyone must fade out of the picture, I will be that one. So instead of arguing over which of us gets to have married the woman that he's just married, they're arguing over which of them will get out of the picture.
Must be a really fun person to be around. No, I'm good. I'm good. That's you. That's you. All right, cool. No, I insist. After you, sir.
Maybe. The soldier refuses to accept that as a solution, runs over to the water along the wharf and throws himself in, only to be followed by the bride, who chases him into the water, and then the groom, who chases her into the water. All three of them throw themselves into the ocean.
Worst wedding ever.
I don't know. It sounds pretty entertaining to me.
I'd be at the cocktail bar like, so we still get the food and the drinks, right? Like
you just split
this is all paid for. We might as well not let it go to waste.
A, 3 more place settings, and B, everybody gets to split the presents.
Right. I'm taking my card back.
Right. This Williams-Sonoma gift card is going home with me. So LaBruce says that in the dream, the crowd is totally distraught and like flips out over this. And a bunch of guys just like throw off their overcoats and try to dive in and rescue the 3 of them, but they can't be found.
Oh.
And then LaBruce wakes up on the beach. And he says, quote, suddenly I became aware that I was not alone on the wharf. For some reason, I did not feel inclined to investigate, but something impelled me to turn my head. Standing a few feet away from my improvised bed, I saw 2 figures. I realized with a start that they were dressed like the people in my dream, and that the woman closely resembled the bride and the man, the groom. So LaBruce, having like just awakened and still sort of in that sleep confusion, he thinks that maybe the boat has come and gone, and maybe these 2 are people who are like playing a joke on him somehow. So he asks who they are, and he says that he has his car ready to take them to the beach if they need to go somewhere, but they just ignore him. He then asks them again, and they start walking away, whispering to each other. So at this point, LaBruce gets mad.
Well, that's rude.
It was interesting, though. It was like one of those differences in social norms, because quite frankly, if I didn't have any business with someone in public and they were like, who are you? I would be perfectly comfortable just walking away from them. And I can see how maybe that was not the case then. But like these days, somebody who's just like looking at their phone and doesn't feel like answering a question, big deal. But it was really interesting to me to note how he says in his own accounting of it that he just like immediately is mad that these people will not speak to him.
Well, it was a different time.
We've talked about that excuse.
But I'm saying, like, it is not normal.
I know. So he yells at them and says, you'd better tell me who you are. And if you don't, I'll find out.
Okay, that's too far. That's too far. Yeah. I mean, it's okay to be like rude.
Yeah, right. But then as soon as he realizes how angry he's gotten, and he's like getting worked up about this, he started wondering, did he himself get carried back in time, as he puts it? Or
cool.
He's like, or did I die? Am I the ghost?
I love that these are the things that he's thinking.
Right. I feel like I could have really vibed with Eugene LaBruce. He says that as soon as he started thinking along those lines, the couple simply vanishes from view, just like snap, they're gone. They're there 1 second, they're gone the next. He cannot see them. He cannot find them. And there's nowhere they could have gone. They just vanish. And as soon as they vanish, the motorboat pulls up to the wharf with his 11 o'clock customers. So he goes about his business and tries to just act like everything is normal. He says that a few months later, he had gone to the wharf one night at midnight to pick up a special party. Like they'd specially scheduled with him to be there at an unusual time because they had booked a boat to carry them across.
Party boat.
Yes. And when he gets there, he picks up a young man and a young woman who are a couple, and a young woman going to the beach with them. and they're all going to go meet some friends who are already on the beach. Couple get in the back seat, and the young woman sits in the passenger seat next to him, and they start driving. And they're like talking excitedly about the beach and how happy they are to be there and can't wait to see the friends that are waiting for them. And he describes how they're driving down this like crushed shell sort of gravel road. Like it's not gravel, it's crushed shell to mark the road. When suddenly in the path of the car appear the brunette bride and the blonde groom that he had seen in his dream and immediately upon waking from it. They just are there in the road. Well, he doesn't have anywhere to pull off. At first, he just thinks that there are people in the road just walking. And he doesn't have anywhere to pull off because this is passing through an area where the road is narrow and there is nothing on the shoulder. So he slams on the brakes and it throws everybody around in the car. The couple in the road, though, take absolutely no notice of the fact that he nearly hits them. The couple in the back of his car that he's driving get really mad that he slammed on the brakes and like tossed them around in the car. So he tells them that he did it as a joke, but to throw you and your girl together.
Nice.
But this does not, in fact, make things better for the passengers that are with him. They're really mad. And so they're just like, just get us to the beach.
They did not see it then, is what we're to assume?
The people in the back clearly did not see it, but he notes that the woman in the passenger seat next to him seems consumed with her own thoughts for the rest of the trip.
Okay.
So he gets them all to the beach. The couple in the back are like, yay, we're here. They get out of the car. And the woman in the passenger seat says to them, y'all go ahead. I want to stay here and talk to the driver for a minute. She then grills him about why he stopped the car. She just keeps asking, like, what did you see in the road that made you stop the car? You obviously saw something in the road. What did you see? I want to hear what you saw. And eventually he will not answer her question honestly. And she says, well, I know why you stopped it, because you saw that man and woman in Civil War clothes. And I saw them too. And I want you to admit that you saw them.
Nice.
And he says that he refused to admit to her that that's what he saw, but he knew now that she had seen the same thing he did, and that it was not just some figment of his imagination, which he was a little concerned it might have been. But that's kind of the end of his story. He notes that nothing like that ever happened to him again, and he never saw the ghosts on future work nights, and he doesn't have any knowledge of there ever having been a church in that location. It's worth mentioning that South Carolina Folktales notes that the LaBruce family owned a different former plantation nearby named Arundel and had owned that property since the 19th century. So his family apparently had a lot of history, but it doesn't specifically say that he was directly related or closely related to those people.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they say this to kind of give his recollection some validity, but also his recollection is that there was never a structure like that in that place. However, he also says that he never could shake the feeling that what he had seen was in some way, to some degree, real, whatever we decide real might mean, which is probably a totally different episode. And so I thought, well, let's look it up. Let's see if this guy really existed. Let's see if this family really existed. And the answer is, oh, yeah, he totally did.
That's so recent.
And in the 1910 census, his profession is listed as motor engineer.
I'm a motor engineer. You drive Uber?
He knew cars. He had a car. People who had a car at the time commonly made money by driving them.
Yeah.
And importantly, this is not like some legend picked up second or third hand and cycled into local lore. It's not something that's been heavily romanticized. This is supposedly a firsthand account given to the people working at that time, a mere 15 or 20 years later, when LaBruce was still very much alive. He died in the 1950s and still lived in that community. He lived in that community throughout.
Mm-hmm.
But he gave this story to people working to collect stories of the supernatural in that area at that time. So supposedly this is straight from the horse's mouth and written down by a real historian.
This is great.
And this version of things was not obscure by any wild stretch. At first I was like, well, maybe this is just, the only place it ever got recorded and nobody had ever really heard it. But in the course of looking for information on him, I ran across the existence of something. I don't know if it still exists. I don't know how long it existed. But in December 1969, there was an issue of a periodical published by the state archives called Tar Heel Junior Historian. And it was a magazine written by kids in like local chapters of this club called Tar Heel Junior Historians, who would like write articles around a theme and write poems and limericks and stuff like that, and then send them in to the state archives. And then 4 times a year, the state archives would compile them into a little zine and publish it. And the December 1969 issue was digitized as part of the North Carolina state government records. And that issue is all about like ghosts and ghost stories. And there's a crossword puzzle in that issue in which the clue is the ghosts of blank as described by Eugene LeBruce. And the answer is Hagley.
Huh.
And so it was considered known enough to expect like junior high kids in the 60s who were into history in the Carolinas, obviously, but are not like professional obscure historians somewhere. They're expected to be able to get that answer, or at least to be drawn to that answer as a possibility.
This is great. This feels like you've unearthed like a true lost little treasure.
Yeah. It made me wonder, is this version of the Gray Man of Pawley's Island where the romanticized explanation of the fiance who dies,
right,
the bride who is distraught comes from? And was this version sort of used, misinterpreted, recycled, whatever, restitched into the version that you can find on like real estate websites in the area? Which is not to say that the Gray Man as a phenomenon is invalid at all.
No.
It's to say that like somebody who knew about that phenomenon might have gone looking for an explanation and run across this.
I'm like at a loss for words. I'm trying to process what I'm trying to say. It feels like hyper localized to that location, right?
Yes.
That wharf, where that wharf was, that road near the wharf, blah, 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 blah. You said there was information showing that there maybe wasn't a church right there, or a structure. But that doesn't preclude ceremonies from occurring or whatever. Think of every destination, and I say destination, think of every not in a church wedding you've ever been to, right? Like
right.
They can be anywhere.
Yeah.
People will get married anywhere. It's just interesting to think like, what if time really did fold over on itself, or there was like a pocket dimension there, and like he like did bear witness to something, and it wasn't really a dream. There's a million fun ways you can go with explaining. Okay, not explaining because it's unexplainable, but there's a million different directions you can go with theories on what that might have been, if more than just a dream.
Totally. I even wondered, what if it's not even different from the Gray Man of Pawley's Island that we've already talked about?
Mm-hmm.
What if this is the way that the Gray Man of Pawley's Island appeared to this person to warn him of something? What if by delaying his car by a minute, he prevented something much worse? There's so many what ifs around this that I love it. But I think that a pretty strong possibility that has to be considered is that this is sort of like the seed for that specifically very generic version that we've heard of the Gray Man explanation, mm-hmm. which, as I say, is not to say that the Gray Man is not a real phenomenon or that he doesn't really warn people. We found countless real people who reported seeing him, and their reports were incredibly consistent, literally across multiple centuries. And Tally Johnson has told us that he knows people who have seen him. Every time I've ever talked about this anywhere at a convention, there's somebody I know who's like, oh yeah, my aunt saw him, or, whatever.
People put videos on YouTube's. YouTube's. Wow, please. I would say edit that out, but it's funny.
We're keeping that one.
Go watch it on the YouTubes. But people have posted videos of, strange mists and stuff like that, and said that it's the Gray Man. It's more than just like dust in your lens kind of thing.
Right.
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about like odd mists at the shore that seem to move autonomously. I am really struggling because I have not had lunch today.
Oh, gosh.
And I normally have it about an hour and a half ago.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, it's not your fault. It's my fault. I got a jar of peanut butter here, and I've got a jar of jelly, but I don't eat bread.
Oh.
My schedule is completely out of whack today. Anyway, this is a really fun one, and I like it, especially because it's like hyper localized to a specific spot that anybody could conceivably go to. Like if we were able to determine, like, oh, this is where the wharf was, or maybe still is. I have no idea, but you could visit that spot because it sounds like it's public, and I think that's a lot of fun. So you, intrepid listener, go find it.
I think one of my favorite things about it, and I swear after this, I'll let you go eat lunch, is it kind of reinforces the idea that with a lot of things, there's sort of a spectrum of phenomenon, a spectrum of experience with any given phenomenon. And I don't think that this detracts from any of that spectrum of experience of the Gray Man. I think it adds to it. think it adds something to this. It's another time when somebody has seen something, had something happen to them there that's similar to what other people have experienced in some ways, and kind of reinforces that there's something there.
Do you know what the best part of this story for me is?
What?
No one has tried to tie it to Blackbeard. It is a beach ghost that no one has tried to say is Blackbeard.
If I remember correctly, in the first Gray Man episode, I said that there are people who try to say,
yeah.
But that's that Gray Man. And this is a different Gray Man.
This is Charcoal Man.
Yes. I just think that's a really neat story.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. Thank you for digging that up. And I think it's amazing that you were able to get that book digitized and that other people can check it out now. Gold star for that. I say that sounds really patronizing. That's not how I meant it to be. I think it's worth recognizing that you took the time to contact them about doing that, and then they took the time to fulfill that request, and now that resource is available to anyone.
Yeah, I think it's really important to keep in mind that a lot of libraries have that sort of service, and it's worth asking. And the state library is willing to do that. And you don't have to drive to Raleigh to do that. You don't have to drive to the South Carolina library at the University of South Carolina. You can just put in these requests, and if they have the ability, they'll do it. It might take some time, but they'll do it.
All right. Don't know where this will line up in our spooky season lineup, but we hope you're enjoying our spooky season lineup and the truckload of episodes that we have backed up to upload on you.
Yeah, either you are enjoying it, you will enjoy it, or you have enjoyed it, whatever the case might be.
Yeah. Right. What is time and space? Who knows where this episode will fall?
Yeah, definitely don't ask Eugene LaBruce. He's still trying to work it out.
I would love to find out if Eugene LaBruce had kids at any point, because if he's working in 1918, and had kids, they might still be alive.
Oh, sure. He was born in 1889 and he died in the 1950s. He died in 1954. It's entirely possible that he has children who are still alive or grandchildren who are still alive. I looked up his census records, but I didn't look forward that far in his census records. I just sort of want to confirm him then.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that to say that we should track people down and be like, tell me your legends.
No. I'm just saying I don't know.
Yeah, we're very fortunate with that one story where there was family alive that was willing to volunteer a story.
Yeah.
And that was great, but that's not something that we do. We don't go knocking on people's doors virtually or physically and be like, tell me your family lore.
Yeah, gosh, no. It'd be weird.
Be weird and rude. It's not the olden days. It's a different time now. And you can't do that. Hope you're enjoying the spooky season programming. I'm not going to plug any upcoming events because I don't know if they've happened yet or not. Yay!
Yeah.
Recording in the past. Could hear it in the future.
You should go eat your lunch.
Yeah, I should do that. Everyththing's out of whack.
Before you turn into a gray man.
I actually have a very gray blue appearance right now. The reflection on my monitor. So
yeah, you do. It's funny.
It's already begun.
You've been listening to Arcane Carolinas. Thanks for joining us. If you liked it, give us a rating, leave a comment. If you didn't like it, send us an email and tell us why. If you're not wrong, we'll try to fix it.
And if you're interested in award-winning speculative fiction, including science fiction, urban fantasy, and horror, find me, Michael G. Williams, at www.michaelgwilliamsbooks.com and check out Falstaff Books at falstaffbooks.com.
If you'd like to pick up some Arcane Carolinas merch, look at behind-the-scenes info, pictures, videos, stuff like that, all the things that get cut, check out arcanecarolinas.com, where you can get access to our Patreon, our Facebook, our Twitter, our Instagram, all that in one place, including the merch store. Buy a shirt.
Clothe your body.
Drape your body in our wares.
Be our living billboards. Did he himself like, oh, my internet connection is unstable.